Here we explore the human experience through the mind, the body, and the soul. Mind Lounge is not about answers. It's about insight. Settle in. Open your mind. Let the conversation begin.
You know, when we started Deep Dive and we're talking about fraud on a massive scale, I mean, we're looking at $250 million in just a single scheme.
A single scheme?
And potentially, the estimates are as high as $9 billion across Minnesota's entire safety net over the last decade.
It's a staggering figure.
It is. And, usually your mind goes to high finance, right?
Yeah.
You're picturing these like super complex derivatives or offshore banking schemes.
Right. Or, cryptocurrency rug pulls, some kind of elaborate hack.
Mm-hmm.
You expect a certain level of technical sophistication.
Exactly. You expect the crime to be hidden behind like layers of code or these just impenetrable legal structures.
Yeah, you think it takes a genius to pull it off.
But the documents we're looking at today, they describe something completely different. It's almost mundane in its genius.
It really is.
We aren't looking at a bank heist. We're looking at a crime that was committed through food pantries, through programs meant to feed children.
And not just any children, but children during a global pandemic. I mean, the money was specifically allocated to feed hungry kids when schools were closed. And instead, it was funneled into luxury cars, resort real estate, international land deals. And the mechanism wasn't some brilliant computer hack.
No.
It was paperwork.
It was paperwork, and I think this is the crucial distinction we have to make right at the top. It was also policy.
Oh.
That's what makes this so important. The Feeding Our Future scandal, it isn't just a story about a bunch of criminals deciding to steal money.
Right.
It's a case study in what happens when you design a massive government system based on, let's say, compassion, but you completely strip away the verification.
That's the paradox, isn't it? They're one the sources keep calling the paradox of good intentions.
Exactly.
And that's what we have to unpack today. How do these programs, designed with the best of intentions to be low barrier, to help the most vulnerable people as fast as humanly possible, how do they end up becoming the absolute perfect vehicle for organized crime? And not just a vehicle, but a conduit. That's the specific word the legislative auditor used in the 2024 report, and it's a powerful one.
Conduit.
It implies the system wasn't just passive. It was actively channeling the money to the fraudsters. We're going to look at how the bureaucracy itself, maybe paralyzed by a fear of being seen as inequitable or, racist, actually helped facilitate the theft.
So for this deep dive, we've got court documents, we've got the 2024 and the 2025 auditor reports, and we have some of the internal emails, which they show exactly what people were thinking while this was all unfolding.
Yeah, the inside view.
We're going to trace the money literally from the federal child nutrition program through hundreds of shell companies, all the way to suitcases full of cash at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport.
And we have to address the human element, too, because this isn't just about numbers and policy. This story is centered largely, though not exclusively, on the Somali community in Minnesota. And there is this massive tension there right now that the sources highlight. You have these legitimate nonprofit owners, people who've been doing good work for years.
And they're looking at this wreckage.
And they're wondering, who do I blame? Do I blame the system that let this happen that was so easy to cheat? Or do I blame the people in my own community who exploited it and, ruined our reputation?
That is a tough question.
It's a brutal one.
Okay. It is messy, it's complex, and frankly, it is an infuriating story. So let's tear this apart.
Let's get into it.
So I want to start with the mechanics, because to steal $250 million, you can't just walk into a bank and ask for it. You need a structure.
We needed a system.
And that structure, it starts with the federal child nutrition program. This isn't some new experimental program, is it?
No, not at all. It's been around for decades. It's a massive federal initiative, the bedrock of school lunches, really. It's designed to ensure kids get fed, particularly those from low-income families.
And normally it operates through schools, right? Or like licensed daycares.
Exactly. Incredibly structured environments. You have a cafeteria, you have staff,
Yeah.
you have students who are actually enrolled, you can count them. It is, very hard to fake an entire school.
You can't just invent a high school in a parking lot.
Well, as we'll see. Some people tried. But yeah, traditionally, it's very robust.
But this fraud didn't happen through schools. It happened through something the documents called the sponsorship model. Can you explain that relationship? Because this seems to be where the bridge for the fraud was built.
It's the absolute key. So the government, in this case, the Minnesota Department of Education, or MDE, they don't have the manpower to cut individual checks to every single small community center or every church basement or every little after-school club that wants to provide meals.
It's just too much administrative work.
Way too much. So to solve that, they designate a sponsor.
A middleman.
The perfect word for it. The sponsor is the administrative umbrella. They get a cut of the federal funds, usually about 10 to 15%, for administrative costs.
Okay.
And in exchange for that fee, they are supposed to oversee all the local sites under their umbrella. The sponsor is legally responsible for being the cop on the beat.
So they're supposed to be the ones verifying that, the sites are real, that a kitchen actually exists, that the meals are really being served.
All of it. They're the state's eyes and ears on the ground.
So the state writes one massive check to the sponsor, and then the sponsor is supposed to responsibly distribute it to all the little guys.
Correct. And this is where Feeding Our Future enters the picture. Feeding Our Future was one of these official state-sanctioned sponsors, and at the head of it was a woman named Amy Bach.
Let's talk about Amy Bach for a second, because if you look at the indictments, and there are a lot of them.
Over 80 people charged.
Over 80. And the vast majority of them are of Somali descent. But Amy Bach is a white woman. And the federal prosecutors, they identified her as the mastermind. Why is that distinction so important to the mechanics of this fraud?
I think it's critical because it completely challenges the narrative that this was purely an outsider crime, just some immigrant group figuring out a scam.
Right.
You can't just walk in off the street with no experience and defraud the federal government of $250 million. It doesn't work that way. You need a bridge. You need someone who speaks bureaucrat.
You need someone who knows which forms to fill out.
Who knows the forms, who knows the deadlines, what the error margins are. And maybe most importantly, you need someone who knows how to push back, legally and politically, when the state starts asking questions.
And Amy Bach had that background.
She had that background. She understood the system from the inside. She was the credibility shield. Without her as the official sponsor validating all this fraudulent paperwork, the state would have likely shut down those individual distribution sites much, much earlier.
So she basically opened the gate and then held it open while everyone else just ran through with bags of money.
That's a very fair assessment.
Yeah.
She connected the, let's call it the insider administrative layer of government bureaucracy to the outsider distribution layer that was being set up on the street.
She was the key that unlocked the whole thing.
She was.
Okay, now let's look at what was actually happening or not happening at these so-called distribution sites. Because the numbers, I was looking through these spreadsheets from the court documents, and they just defy physics.
They're completely absurd. It's almost laughable.
We're not talking about, massive stadiums or convention centers that could plausibly handle huge crowds. We were talking about small storefronts. We're talking about apartments.
We're talking about literal empty parking lots.
Right. And these tiny, sometimes non-existent locations were claiming to feed thousands and thousands of children a day.
Every single day.
Yeah.
7 days a week.
There's one specific example I saw mentioned in the source material, a site that claimed to serve more meals every single day than the largest high school cafeteria in the entire state of Minnesota.
Just stop and think about the logistics of that for a second.
Yeah.
If you were serving, say, 3,000 meals a day from one location, you need semi-trucks delivering food constantly. You need industrial-sized refrigerators and freezers. You need an enormous amount of trash generation.
You'd have lines of people that would stretch for blocks and blocks. It would look like a music festival every single day.
It would be impossible to hide.
Impossible. The whole neighborhood would know about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You cannot hide that level of activity.
Yeah.
And yet, when investigators eventually went to these sites, there were no trucks. There were no lines. There was no food. It was a quiet parking lot.
But on paper.
On paper, it looked pristine. The invoices were perfect. The numbers matched up.
Because they weren't just making up numbers out of thin air. They were meticulously manufacturing an alternate reality using data.
That's a great way to put it.
Which brings us to my absolute favorite detail from this whole story. And I use that word loosely because it's so infuriatingly simple.
I know where you're going with this.
Listofrandomnames.com.
It is the banality of evil. Truly, it's just incredible.
So explain this. To get reimbursed by the government, you can't just say, I fed 2,000 kids. You need a roster.
You need a roster. The regulations require an attendance sheet. They need to know who ate the food.
Yeah.
So if you claim you fed 2,000 kids on Tuesday, you need to provide a list with 2,000 names.
And these fraudsters, of course, didn't have 2,000 kids. They didn't have any kids.
So they went to the internet. They literally found a website called listofrandomnames.com. They would, type in generate 2,000 names, and it would spit out a list.
And they just copied and pasted.
They copied the output, pasted it directly into the Excel spreadsheets the state required, and emailed it in as proofs of service.
Did they even try to make it look real? I mean, did they filter it for like age-appropriate names or demographics that would match the neighborhood?
Barely, if at all. The sources say the algorithms often spit out names that were statistically, let's just say, improbable for the specific community they were supposedly serving.
So you'd have, what, like a list of mostly Irish-sounding names for a Somali neighborhood?
Things like that. You'd have lists of names that just didn't match the local population at all. But because the volume of paperwork was so high, and as we're about to discuss, the oversight was so paralyzed, it just went through, nobody checked.
So you have fake names attached to fake meals coming from over 250 fake distribution sites.
Correct. These were shell companies. Over 250 of them created for this purpose.
And they existed purely to catch the money that was basically falling from the sky.
That's it. They were just empty buckets.
And once they caught the money, where did it go? Because the indictments read like a luxury lifestyle magazine. We see reports of, real estate in Kenya, luxury apartments in Nairobi, property in Turkey.
It went everywhere. It went into the typical fraud purchases you see here in the U.S., the Porsches, the Teslas, the expensive homes in the suburbs.
Sure.
But a very significant portion was laundered internationally. And the method of transport is it's like something out of a 1980s drug movie. It's so low tech. It's brilliant.
You're talking about the suitcases.
I'm talking about the suitcases.
Yeah.
We have direct evidence and testimony of millions and millions of dollars in cash being withdrawn from banks, packed into carry-on luggage.
Carry on, not even checked bag.
Packed into luggage and physically transported through Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport to Somalia, to Dubai, to Kenya, and other locations.
It is just staggering to think about that much raw cash moving through a TSA checkpoint. But okay, we have the mechanics, we can see how the machine worked, but a machine like that, it doesn't run in a vacuum. It needs an environment that allows it to function without anyone pulling the plug.
It needs an open door. And the state not only left the door open, they kind of took it off the hinges.
Which brings us to our second section, this concept of low barrier. Because this phrase, low barrier, it comes up in almost every single policy document related to these funds. We need to define this. What does it actually mean in the world of social services?
So in social services and public policy, low barrier refers to a philosophy. It's a way of thinking that's designed to remove any and all obstacles for people who are in a crisis.
Okay.
The logic is really rooted in compassion. The idea is if someone is hungry or homeless or in deep, deep poverty, you don't want to force them to jump through a bunch of complex bureaucratic hoops to get help.
Right. You don't want someone to starve to death because they lost their driver's license in a fire or they don't have a recent utility bill in their name to prove residency.
That's the perfect example. So low barrier programs are characterized by minimal documentation, usually no ID required, no proof of income required, and importantly, no behavioral prerequisites.
What does that mean?
Like, for a housing program, you don't need to prove you're sober to get a bed for the night. The goal is immediate access. Help first, ask questions later.
And that makes a lot of sense in a normal environment when you're dealing with people on an individual basis. But then COVID happened.
The pandemic was the catalyst. It was the accelerator. It changed all the rules of the game overnight. The government, at both the federal and state level, made a conscious decision to prioritize speed over security.
Get the money out the door.
Get the money out the door fast because the entire economy was collapsing and people were hurting.
So they waived the rules.
They issued waivers.
Yeah.
And these waivers, when you look at them together, were incredibly significant. First, and I think this is the most important one, no in-person inspections.
This has to be the big one. Because normally if I say, hey, I'm opening a food pantry in my office, someone from the state is supposed to come check if I actually have an office and a pantry, right?
100% correct. They check your refrigerators, they check your health code compliance, they make sure the building is real. But during COVID, to maintain social distancing, state officials just stopped visiting sites.
They stopped verifying if the food or even the building itself was actually there.
Correct.
So I could literally say, I'm feeding 5,000 kids a day out of my garage, and nobody is coming to check my garage.
That is exactly what happened. The second major waiver was expanded eligibility. This was huge. Suddenly, for-profit restaurants were allowed to participate in these child nutrition programs.
And that's a big deal because
Previously, they were almost exclusively reserved for nonprofits and schools. You're now inviting profit-seeking entities into what was designed as a charity model.
it completely changes the incentive.
Completely. And third, they allowed for off-site distribution. Food could be handed out in parking lots, from the trunk of a car, in private homes, essentially anywhere. So you combine those three things. You can be a for-profit business operating out of a parking lot with absolutely no one from the state ever coming to check if you were actually there.
It's the perfect storm for fraud. You couldn't design a better system for it if you tried.
It is systemic vulnerability by design. And it wasn't just the food program. This was happening across the board. The Minnesota Department of Human Services, DHS, they identified 14 different types of Medicaid providers as high risk for fraud, specifically because the barrier to entry was so low.
Oh, I saw the numbers on one of those in particular, the Housing Stabilization Services, or HSS. This one really blew my mind.
This is a classic example of low barrier intentions gone horribly wrong. HSS was a pretty niche program. It was intended to cost the state about $2.6 million a year.
Okay, 2.6 million, a rounding error in a state budget.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By 2025, the actual cost of that same program had exploded to $122 million.
Wait, from 2.6 million to 122 million. That's not just growth.
Yeah,
that's exponential. That's a 4,000% increase or something.
The growth was astronomical. And the reason cited over and over again in the investigations is minimal records requirements. The program invited exploitation. It was essentially built on an honor system.
And as our notes here say, which I think is the line of the episode, they built a system on the honor system in an environment where dishonor was incredibly profitable.
That's the perfect way to sum it up.
Yeah.
I mean, when you remove all the gatekeepers to help people faster, you're making a massive assumption.
Which is?
You're assuming that everyone walking through that gate is there for the right reasons.
Yeah.
You're assuming the wolves won't notice that the fence is down and the sheep are just wandering around.
But here's the thing that bugs me, and I can't get past it. Lax rules are one thing, I get that. But usually, if a bureaucrat, even a mid-level one, sees a single application from a parking lot claiming to feed 5,000 kids a day, common sense should kick in. A red flag should go up. They should say, stop, halt everything. Why didn't they stop it? What happened to common sense?
This is where we get into the most complex and honestly the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. Because it wasn't just incompetence or laziness. It was that oversight was actively and consciously paralyzed by fear.
We're calling this section the weaponization of equity. That's a heavy term.
It is, but I think the evidence suggests it's accurate. The fraudsters, and specifically Amy Bach and Feeding Our Future, they learned to use the state's own commitment to equity as a shield to deflect any and all scrutiny.
So how did that actually play out? What did they do?
Okay, so when the Minnesota Department of Education, the MDE, when they finally started to see these blindingly obvious red flags and they tried to pause payments or just ask for more validation on some of these suspicious claims, Feeding Our Future didn't just appeal the decision through normal administrative channels.
Yeah.
They didn't argue the facts. They immediately sued.
But they went nuclear right away.
Instantly. And they sued specifically for discrimination.
So their argument wasn't, our paperwork is correct. It was, you're only asking us for more paperwork because our providers are minorities.
Precisely. And they were aggressive about it. We have emails from the discovery process from Randa Watkins, who was an attorney for Feeding Our Future. In one email to the MDE, he explicitly called their questions about the sites. His words were the epitome of systemic racism.
The epitome of systemic racism, just for asking, hey, can you prove you're actually feeding these kids you're billing us for?
Correct. The core of their legal argument was that by questioning these minority-owned providers, the state was applying a racist double standard. And it wasn't just the lawyers in the background. This went public.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Jamal Osman, who's a Minneapolis City Council member, he made a public video accusing the MDE of using racist tactics simply because they slowed down the flow of money to investigate.
So they created a political firestorm around it?
They did. And Amy Bach was right at the center of this strategy.
Of course.
The prosecutors in her indictment described her as using bullying tactics. She would constantly threaten regulators with accusations of racism to get them to back down. She knew that the state officials were terrified of being seen as obstructing services to minority communities.
And you have to remember the context here. This is 2020, 2021. This is Minnesota.
The shadow of the George Floyd murder is everywhere. The entire state, the entire country, is going through this massive racial reckoning.
So the political climate was incredibly charged.
Incredibly. State agencies were under immense public and political pressure to prove their commitment to equity, to prove they weren't racist.
Yeah.
And the fraudsters knew that if they framed basic oversight as bias, the state would freeze up.
And it worked.
It worked spectacularly well. The 2024 Legislative Auditor Report is devastatingly clear on this point. State officials admitted in interviews that they were hesitant to act quickly. They were afraid of being labeled as racist. They were afraid of the political and community backlash.
They were afraid of the headlines.
They were afraid of the headline.
There was even a court order, right? I read that a judge actually told the state they had to keep paying Feeding Our Future.
Yes, and that is the ultimate catch-22 of this entire situation. A judge looked at the case in its early stages and said, essentially, MDE, you haven't proven fraud yet. You only suspect it. Therefore, stopping payments while you investigate is a violation of their due process. You have to resume payments.
So the state was legally compelled by a court to continue funding a crime because they hadn't finished investigating the crime yet.
And they couldn't investigate the crime effectively because the COVID waivers they themselves put in place blocked them from doing in-person inspections.
It's a perfect trap. It's completely circular.
It was. The low barrier waivers removed the physical checks and balances, and the equity lawsuit and political pressure removed the administrative checks and balances. The door wasn't just unlocked, it was taken off its hinges and burned.
It really suggests that the most fundamental mechanism of oversight, the simple ability for a person to look at something and say, hang on, this looks wrong, that was dismantled by the fear of bad PR.
It created that conduit for fraud we talked about. The bad actors realized that the state's commitment to equity, which is, a noble and important value,
Ours.
was also, in this context, a critical vulnerability they could exploit. They knew that if they just screamed discrimination loud enough, the checkbook would open back up.
So you've got the system with the door off its hinges. You've got the paralysis of the regulators. Now let's talk about the third piece of this puzzle, the community. Because this was, as we said, centered largely within the Somali community in Minnesota.
Right. And almost every source we looked at describes this community as tight-knit. And that term tight-knit really acts as a double-edged sword here.
Okay, explain that. What do you mean?
Well, on the positive side, it's a huge strength. It means strong support networks. If someone is struggling, if a family needs help, the community rallies. There's a lot of trust and mutual support.
But the negative side?
On the negative side, the traffickers in this fraud used those exact same trusted relationships to recruit participants.
So it spread through word of mouth, through people you trust.
Exactly. The sources describe it as a social contagion. Think about it. If a trusted elder or a local business leader or a religious figure in your community comes to you and says, hey, this is how we get funding for our projects. This is a legitimate government program. Look, I'm doing it and it's working.
You're going to believe them.
You're going to follow their lead. You trust the person telling you more than you understand the fine print of the federal regulations.
And there was immense financial pressure, too. The sources are clear. It wasn't just a handful of kingpins wanting to buy Ferraris.
No, and that's a really important nuance. Yes, there were absolutely luxury cars and extravagant spending. But the sources also highlight what one called a Robin Hood distortion.
A Robin Hood distortion.
Many people in this community have extended family, deep connections back in Somalia.
Where there is extreme poverty, drought, political instability.
All of it. So there's this intense, culturally ingrained pressure to send money back home. Remittances are a huge part of the economy there. You have to support your village, support your clan.
So in their minds, some of them might have been able to justify it. Like, I'm not stealing for me. I'm taking money from a rich, faceless government to feed my starving family back home.
That appears to be part of the psychology, yes.
Right.
And you combine that with what is often a deep-seated distrust of state institutions to begin with.
How so?
Well, many of these folks came from countries with corrupt, predatory governments. They don't necessarily arrive in the U.S. viewing the government as this benevolent entity that must be protected at all costs. They see free money, on the table that a big confusing bureaucracy is handing out.
And if you see a loophole and everyone else you know and trust is taking advantage of it and you have real people you love who are starving back home,
The moral calculus for some people begins to shift. It doesn't make it right. It is still theft on a massive scale. But it helps explain the motivation beyond just simple one-dimensional greed. It helps explain how it spread so fast and wide.
Okay, this brings us to a really critical question, and it's the one we posed at the start. It's something I know you, listening, are probably wondering about. A fraud has been exposed now. Dozens of people are going to jail. But the Somali community in Minnesota is huge, and the vast, vast majority of people had absolutely nothing to do with this.
The overwhelming majority. I mean, we're talking about doctors, teachers, small business owners, nurses, people who are working hard every day and following all the rules.
Exactly. So for those legitimate nonprofit owners and honest business people who are left to deal with the aftermath, how are they feeling right now? Are they mad at the system for being so incompetent and failing them? Or are they mad at the fraudsters from their own community for making them all look bad?
The answer, based on the sources we have, is a very painful and complicated mix of both. But let's look at the anger toward the system first, because it's palpable.
Okay.
Legitimate owners now feel, and this is a quote, criminalized.
Criminalized. How? In what way?
Because of the scale of the fraud, the pendulum has swung wildly in the other direction. The state is overcompensating for its past failures. Now everyone is under the microscope.
So if you're a Somali nonprofit owner, you're automatically a suspect.
That's how they feel, yes. Legitimate nonprofits are telling reporters that they feel intentionally targeted. The level of scrutiny they're under now is unlike anything they've ever experienced.
So the low barrier is completely gone.
It is gone. It's been replaced by what we might call a high wall. The new 2026 regulations that are coming into effect require intensely rigorous reporting.
Which sounds good on the surface.
It sounds good, but in practice, it makes it incredibly hard for the honest, small, community-based organizations to survive. They don't have a team of accountants or lawyers. They don't have the administrative staff to handle this new crushing paperwork load.
So the fraudsters, who took advantage of the simple system, have now ensured that the system is too complicated for the honest people.
The honest organizations are paying the tax for the crime. That is the tragedy of the commons here. They feel like the system failed to protect them from the criminals, and now the system is punishing them for the criminals' actions.
But there has to be anger at the bad apples within the community, too.
Oh, there is. Deep, deep anger. The sources note that this fraud has stained the reputation of the entire demographic.
It feeds into the worst stereotypes.
It absolutely does, and the community knows that. They're acutely aware that this scandal has given ammunition to people who already wanted to cut funding for social programs or attack immigrant communities. So there's intense anger at the fraudsters for inviting this scrutiny and this hate.
But looking at the interviews and reports, it seems like the feeling of being targeted by the government's reaction to the fraud is the dominant pain point right now. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair. It's the feeling of collective punishment. The sentiment is, because my neighbor stole, I am now treated like a criminal by the state. They feel betrayed by the fraudsters, yes, but they feel actively oppressed by the new regulations that have followed.
And in this whole scandal, it's shifted the political landscape in Minnesota pretty significantly, hasn't it?
Hugely. It has fueled arguments against things like affirmative action and any kind of specific minority funding streams. There's a 2026 federal lawsuit mentioned in the sources against Minnesota regarding civil rights violations.
And the argument is what?
Basically, the argument is that the state's intense focus on equity has gone too far and created these kinds of discriminatory, lawless zones where fraud can flourish unchecked.
So the backlash is real, and it's being translated into policy and legal challenges now.
It is. The fallout from this is going to last for years and years.
Before we wrap this all up, there's one more layer to this onion that we have to peel back. We've talked mostly about food, but this low barrier problem, this vulnerability, it went way beyond lunch programs. We have to talk about fraud tourism.
Fraud tourism. It sounds like the world's worst travel brochure.
It really does. But it's a term that prosecutors actually used in their filings. Because the systems in Minnesota were so loose, so famously low barrier, that word got out nationally.
It became a destination for grifters. It's incredible. The prosecutors found that word of mouth had spread so far that people were traveling from as far away as Pennsylvania, Ohio, Arizona to come to Minnesota and register as providers.
So they would fly into Minnesota just to scam the state?
Yes. They came to Minnesota specifically to sign up for these programs because they knew, they had heard that they wouldn't be checked on. It wasn't just a local issue. The reputation of Minnesota as a soft target went national.
And this extended to business grants, too, not just food programs. I saw mentions of the Promise Act in the reports.
Yes, the Promise Act, the Emerging Entrepreneur Loan Program, a whole suite of them. These were grant programs designed to help small businesses, specifically those owned by minorities, women, veterans, groups that traditionally have had trouble getting capital from banks.
So again, best of intentions, trying to level the economic playing field.
Great intentions. A noble goal of addressing historical inequities. But then you look at how they were designed. They relied heavily on self-certification of losses.
So you just had to check a box saying, I promise I lost money during the pandemic.
That's basically it. And to speed up the distribution, to get the money out the door as fast as possible, they often used lottery systems instead of merit-based audits of applications.
A lottery? You're kidding.
Not kidding. If your application met the basic minimal qualifications on paper, you were put into a pool. And if your name was picked, you got the grant.
That seems wildly inefficient for catching fraud.
It's terrible for catching fraud. Think about it. If I'm a legitimate business owner and I spend weeks putting together my detailed books in my application, and I'm competing against a shell company with a completely fake application.
In a lottery system, you both have the same odds of winning.
And the fraudster probably didn't submit one application. They probably submitted 50 under different shell company names.
So their odds were actually much better.
Much better. This is the paradox we keep coming back to. These programs were structurally designed to favor minority groups to try and fix past wrongs. But in the process of streamlining the design, by removing the screens, the credit checks, the audits, the things that slow it down, they removed the only things that actually catch fraud.
So by trying to be more equitable in distribution, they made the whole system more vulnerable to exploitation.
And ultimately, that vulnerability ends up hurting the very communities they were trying to help. Because now the money is gone, stolen by fraudsters, and the programs are either being shut down or so heavily restricted that the honest people can't access them anymore.
It's just a tragedy all around.
It really is. A tragedy of good intentions.
So let's try and bring this home. Let's summarize. What does this all mean? We've got this massive, audacious scheme, a completely paralyzed bureaucracy, and a community that's now caught in the crossfire of the fallout.
I think if you want to summarize the perfect storm here, it's 4 things. You had a global pandemic that flooded the entire system with a tsunami of unchecked federal cash.
Right.
You had an administrative philosophy of low barrier access that essentially removed all the locks from all the doors. You had a group of sophisticated criminals who understood how to exploit those first 2 factors. And then the final ingredient, you had a political climate where a credible accusation of racism could literally freeze the oversight mechanisms of the state.
It really is a lesson in policy design, isn't it? It goes beyond just this one case in Minnesota.
It absolutely is. I think the big takeaway for you listening is that this isn't just a Minnesota story. It's a warning. It's a lesson that when we remove gatekeepers, and gatekeepers can be inconvenient, they can be slow.
They can be bureaucratic and annoying.
They can be all of those things. But when we remove them, whether it's inspections or IDs or detailed paperwork, because we want to be nice or fast or more equitable, we are sending out an open invitation for the wolves to come in with the sheep.
You can't have a safety net if you don't actually check who's falling into it.
That's it exactly.
I want to leave everyone with a final thought today, a question to sort of mull over. We talked a lot about how the fear of being called racist stopped the state from doing its fundamental job of protecting taxpayer money.
Right. It was a paralyzing force.
So here's the question. If a system is designed in such a way that simply verifying a claim, just checking if a meal actually exists, checking if a name on a list is a real person, if that basic act of verification is seen as an act of discrimination, is it even possible to have a functional safety net? Or does the fear of causing offense completely dismantle our ability to govern effectively?
That is the $9 billion question, isn't it? And looking at this case, I don't think we have the answer yet.
We certainly don't. Thanks for diving deep with us today. This was a heavy one.
It was. Always a pleasure to break it down.
We'll see you next time.